Good evening. Imagine yourself drifting backward through time, so far that memory, myth, and even light itself have not yet taken shape. There is no Olympus, no earth beneath your feet, no salt of the sea, no wind in the sky. There is only chaos. And it is not the chaos of our modern tongues, not clamor or confusion, not the noisy disorder of a crowded marketplace. No, it is something older, something vast and waiting. Chaos was the yawning void, a gaping expanse without edge or direction. It was not evil, not good, not even neutral. It simply was. A silence so absolute that it pressed like weight on the bones of the cosmos that would one day exist. Ancient poets struggled for words to describe it, reaching for metaphors as fragile as spiderwebs. Hesiod, the farmer poet of Boeotia, whispered that chaos was the first thing, the raw emptiness from which all else emerged. Others would call it the chasm, the gap, the space between what is and what is not. If you close your eyes long enough, perhaps you can feel it, that still, timeless breath before the first heartbeat. From that, nothing stirred the first somethings. Gaia, the earth, solid and unshaking, unfurled herself like fertile soil beneath an unseen sky. Tartarus, the abyss beneath her, opened his maw as the dread of depth itself. And then came Eros, not the mischievous archer of later tales, but a primordial force, the binding agent of desire, attraction, and union. Without him, nothing could join. Nothing could multiply. He was the pulse that turned void into family, emptiness into story. These were not gods as we think of them. No thrones, no temples, no faces gazing down in marble calm. They were truths given shape, earth, depth, love. Night itself came soon after, Nyx, draped in a veil of shadow so dense that even chaos drew back. Beside her came Erebus, the darkness of the underworld, and together they birthed children, made not of clay or blood, but of atmosphere. From them came ether, the pure upper air, bright and thin, breathed only by gods, and Hemera, the day, who pursued her mother endlessly across the sky, never catching, never yielding. Thus night and day began, not through astronomy, but through kinship and chase. The early Greeks, gazing at stars without telescopes, carved sense out of mystery. To them, the cycle of light and dark was not a trick of orbit and axis, but a family quarrel, a dance of mother and daughter whose feet never tired. Myths like this weren't told to amuse, but to reassure. The sun would rise because Hemera chased. Night would return because Nyx demanded it. In that sense, mythology was less entertainment than comfort. A hearthfire story to remind a trembling world that patterns existed even in the void. Gaia, patient and fertile, was not idle. From her vast body, she summoned Uranus, the sky, strewn with stars. He was both her son and her consort, arching over her in endless embrace. Where once the void gaped, now there was form, a domed sky pressing upon the broad plain of earth. From their joining, the first true shape of the world appeared. But Gaia's womb was not finished. She brought forth the mountains, jagged and wild, peaks that clawed upward to meet Uranus's expanse. And then she birthed Pontus, the sea, restless and alive long before oar or sail touched its waves. Already, the earth was not barren. It breathed, it heaved, it promised. Later, philosophers, like the Stoic Cleanthes, would look back on these stories and see in them not literal history, but metaphor. Earth as substance, sky as order, sea as motion, love as cohesion. They sensed what modern physics would eventually echo, that from void, matter, attraction, and form emerged. Yet the ancients wrapped those truths in poetry, for poetry outlasts equations in the hearts of men. If you were a shepherd in archaic Greece, staring into the black vault above your campfire, you might have wondered, what keeps the heavens from collapsing? Why does the soil yield grain, the sea surge with salt, the night bleed into dawn? Myth gave you answers. Answers as alive as you were. The world, it said, is not random. It is born of family, of passion, of betrayal and longing. It is not a dead machine, but a living story. And so from chaos, the yawning chasm, came the first rhythm of existence. Night pursued by day, earth pressed beneath sky, sea heaving against mountain. The void was no longer silent. It was humming with potential. The stage was set for the first generations of beings who would shape the cosmos. Beings vast and elemental, not yet the gods of marble temples, but the forces that trembled behind storm and quake. It is there, at the edge of creation, that we pause. Chaos has birthed form. Gaia has found her mate, and the world has drawn its first outline. But within that outline, tension already stirs. For every union in myth bears the seed of struggle. And the children of earth and sky would soon make the cosmos shake. Now that the yawning void had given birth to form, the silence of chaos was broken by a union that would define the world. Gaia, the broad-breasted earth fertile and unshakable, stretched beneath a new presence, Uranus, the star-speckled sky. He was vast and radiant, her son and her consort, a paradox that myth accepts without hesitation. When he arched himself across her, the world took on a new structure, the heavens above the soil below, one pressing against the other in endless embrace. This pairing was not a marriage in the sense mortals would later know. No priest bound them, no witness signed their vows. It was necessity itself, the coupling of matter and expanse. The Greeks, gazing upward in wonder, saw in the vault of stars a husband stretched across his bride. The very dome above them was not just empty atmosphere, but a body, a presence that pressed down upon them with stars for eyes and silence for breath. From this primal embrace came a brood of children, unlike any that would follow the Titans. 12 in number, 6 sons and 6 daughters. They were not yet the Olympians we know, but beings of elemental magnitude. Each bore a name that whispered of a force older than men's cities. There was Oceanus, the encircling river, who girdled the world in flowing silver. Hyperion, lord of light, from whom the sun and moon would later find their source. Cuius, the inquirer embodiment of intellect, whose gaze pierced the heavens. Crius, bearer of constellations, tethering mortal fate to the stars. Iapetus, destined to father Prometheus and Cronus, the youngest, shrewdest, and most dangerous. And among the daughters, Thea, mother of the radiant sun and moon. Rhea, who would one day bear Olympian gods. Themis, embodiment of divine law and cosmic order. Mnemosyne, memory itself, the wellspring of all song and story. Phoebe, radiant with prophecy, and Tethys, the nourishing sea. Together, they formed a pantheon, not of personalities, but of principles, concepts, made flesh ideas too large for mortals to hold in their minds without turning them into stories. But Gaia's womb was not finished. From her depths came children, far stranger children, whose shapes rattled even the sky himself. First were the Cyclopes, one-eyed smiths, with pupils like burning forges. Their names, Brontes, Steropes, Argus, meant thunder, lightning, and brightness. Their gaze was the strike of storm, their hands the hammer upon which thunderbolts would one day be forged. They were beings of brute craft, feared not for malice, but for the raw, untampered power they carried in every sinew. Then came the Hecaton Kairos, the the 100-handed ones, each with 50 heads stacked upon their massive shoulders and 100 arms branching like trees from their bodies. They were so vast that the world seemed to tremble at their breath. When they stirred, mountains quaked and oceans bucked like frightened animals. To the Greeks, these were not mere monsters, but living metaphors: earthquakes, volcanoes, storms personified raw forces of nature given skin. Uranus looked upon them and shuddered. Though he was the sky, he felt the shadow of fear curl beneath his ribs. The Titans he could endure, stately vast, each a reflection of cosmic balance. But these Cyclopes, these 100-handed ones, they were grotesque, chaotic, ungovernable. In their eyes, he saw not children, but threats. And so he did what many tyrants in myth would later do. He turned away from love and sought control. One by one, he thrust them down into the depths of Gaia, forcing them back into their mother's womb, burying them beneath layer after layer of soil and stone. The earth, once proud and fertile, groaned beneath their weight. Each time Uranus pressed down upon her, he pressed not only as lover, but as jailer, caging her children within her body. The heavens were heavy upon her, her breaths stifled by his weight, and the pain of carrying her own children as prisoners festered into rage. To ancient audiences, this was no abstract tale. They lived on fault lines, amid mountains that shook and seas that surged. The myth of Uranus imprisoning his monstrous children was more than allegory. It was explanation. Why does the earth rumble? Because within it stir the 100-handed ones trapped and restless. Why does thunder split the sky? Because the Cyclopes hammer at their unseen forges beneath the mountains. Myth made terror into story, and story into pattern, a way to live with fear. But Gaia's patience, though vast, was not infinite. She had birthed life into being, filled the world with titans and giants, and watched the sky recoil in horror. The pain of her trapped children gnawed at her, and the bitterness of betrayal spread like roots through her soil. Already, she was fashioning vengeance in the dark. Already, the sickle of stone was forming in her mind, jagged as truth, sharp as grief. The union of earth and sky had shaped the cosmos, but it was not a union of harmony. Beneath its star-strewn dome, tension coiled like a serpent waiting to strike. The children of that union would soon rise, not in reverence, but in rebellion. The union of Gaia and Uranus was not a quiet one. From the very beginning, their bed was crowded with children who were less like infants and more like living embodiments of nature's raw forces. To the Greeks, these children were not fairy tale creatures. They were explanations, myth-made flesh forces given a face. First came the Titans, 12 in all, and their names still ring like echoes of forgotten hymns. Oceanus, the river that encircled the entire world like a serpent of silver. Hyperion, the blazing lord of light, who would father sun, moon, and dawn. Coeus, the sharp-minded inquirer, whose gaze was fixed upon the heavens. Creus, the bearer of constellations, his arms spread with the weight of stars. Iapetus, grim ancestor of mankind, through whom mortality would one day come into the world. And Cronus, the youngest, most cunning, and already watching the horizon with calculating eyes. Among their sisters were powers no less formidable. Theia, radiant mother of heavenly bodies. Rhea, nurturer and destined mother of the Olympian gods. Themis, order and law, given voice, a goddess who embodied justice before courts or codes were dreamed of. Mnemosyne, memory itself, the fountain of all poetry, from whom the muses would later spring. Phoebe, the bright prophetic flame. And Tethys, nourishing sea, a mother to the countless rivers and springs that veined the earth. Together, these titans were less like a family and more like the architecture of reality. When Greeks looked at the sky, felt the sea spray, or tried to explain memory's persistence, they whispered these names. To them, the cosmos was not dead matter, but kin older siblings watching over, or sometimes against, the fragile lives of men. Yet Gaia's womb did not rest after the Titans. She birthed stranger beings, beings that stretched the imagination and struck Uranus with dread. First came the Cyclopes, the one-eyed smiths, each with a single blazing orb at the center of his brow. Brontes, Steropes, and Argus thunder, lightning brightness. They were not just giants with a deformity. They were volcanoes, erupting lightning storms, tearing the sky fire captured in human form. Later myths would call them the forgers of Zeus's thunderbolts hammering in caverns beneath mountains. To people living in the shadow of Etna or Stromboli, this made sense when the earth roared and fire spilled. It was the Cyclopes at their forge. Then came the Hecatoncheires, beings so vast that even words falter before them. Each had 50 heads and 100 arms, their bodies like living fortresses of flesh. When they stirred, mountains toppled. When they roared, valleys shook. To see one was to glimpse chaos itself straining against order. They were too large, too many, too raw, and their very existence unsettled Uranus. He, the sky, who cloaked himself in stars, looked upon his children and felt fear coil in his chest. This fear is where myth turns dark. Uranus did not cherish what Gaia had borne him. He recoiled. He judged. He sought to bury the evidence of his dread. One by one, he forced the Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires back into Gaia's depths. Not into some distant cavern, but into Gaia herself, into her womb, her soil, her body. Imagine the weight of mountains pressing inward, the pain of carrying one's own children as prisoners, and you begin to understand why Gaia began to groan beneath him. The earth trembled not only from the sheer mass of these beings, but from her anguish. In every quake and every fissure, the Greeks heard her cry. They imagined that the shudders beneath their feet were the struggles of those buried children, straining against the vault of stone, trying to claw their way back into the light. And still, Uranus pressed downward. Night after night, he lay across Gaia, not as a tender lover, but as a tyrant, smothering her beneath his vastness. The sky, that should have sheltered and adorned her instead, became her jailer. From this came the first true resentment in the cosmos, a seed of rebellion that would grow sharper than any blade. The story is more than myth, it is pattern. The Greeks, like many ancient peoples, saw in the world a cycle power rising, clutching, fearing its successors, and trying to crush them before they could grow. Kings feared sons, fathers feared heirs, and each age feared the one that would come after. Uranus was not merely sky, he was the first tyrant. And Gaia, who bore the burden, became the first revolutionary. She began to plan. Deep within her body, she fashioned a weapon, not of bronze or iron, for those metals were still centuries from mortal discovery, but of stone. Jagged flint, sharpened by patience, honed by rage. The sickle was her answer, a tool both agricultural and lethal, capable of harvesting grain or cutting down tyrants. She needed only a hand brave enough to wield it. For now, though, the world lay heavy, caught between sky and earth, children buried alive in their mother's body, groaning beneath her soil. The Titans, though, mighty, stood silent, watching and waiting, uneasy, beneath their father's gaze. Only the youngest Cronus, already sharper of mind than the rest, would one day step forward to take the blade. But that is a tale for the next turning of the cosmos. For now, the stage is set, the Titans waiting in uneasy peace, the Cyclopes and hundred-handed ones imprisoned in darkness, Gaia groaning in her pain, and Uranus proud and unyielding, pressing down the heavens upon her, a world half-born, half-buried, trembling toward its first rebellion. Gaia's pain deepened with every passing night. Imagine the earth itself as a mother forced to carry not only the weight of mountains, but the weight of injustice. Within her womb, the Cyclops pounded with fists like thunder. The 100-handed ones twisted and writhed their cries, muted by layers of stone. Above her, Uranus the sky descended nightly, pressing down with a love turned cruel death to her grief. What began as creation had curdled into torment, and so Gaia plotted. From her own body, she shaped a weapon, a sickle hewn of unyielding flint. Its edge was jagged sharp, not only with stone, but with fury. This was no polished tool of bronze, no crafted blade of mortals. It was primal raw, older than metallurgy stone itself, honed into vengeance. In the myths, the sickle is more than weapon. It is the first act of technology, a sign that intelligence can turn nature against its own order. Gaia turned to her children, the Titans, and laid bare her suffering. She spoke not as goddess, but as mother, her voice heavy with betrayal. Your father has wronged me. He has caged your brothers in darkness. He has silenced the womb that bore you. Who among you will help me? One by one, the Titans faltered. Hyperion lowered his gaze. Oceanus withdrew like a tide. Themis remained silent. None dared rise against their father, for Uranus was vast, his stars uncountable, his presence unrelenting. Only one stepped forward, Cronus. The youngest, the cleverest, his heart was not heavy with reverence, but sharpened by calculation. He was watchful, patient, already suspicious of the power his father hoarded. Cronus alone stretched out his hand and said, "Give me the blade." His siblings recoiled, but Gaia's eyes glimmered with fierce hope. At last, one child would bear her vengeance, and so the trap was set. Night fell, as it always did, and Uranus descended, cloaking the earth with his starry body. But this night was different. From the shadows, Cronus lay waiting, the flint sickle clenched in his grip. When Uranus pressed down upon Gaia, binding her once more, Cronus leapt forth. With a steady hand, with no hesitation, he struck. The sickle flashed stone, biting into flesh, and in that moment the cosmos shuddered. The sky himself cried out a roar that rippled across creation. Cronus severed his father, cutting away the source of Uranus's power, and the heavens split from the earth forever. It was an act both violent and necessary, a moment of cosmic revolution. In Hesiod's Theogony, this castration is not only a tale of rebellion, but an allegory of succession, each generation rising to overthrow the last. Fathers fear sons, rulers fear heirs, and power begets paranoia. The Greeks knew this cycle well. Tyrants fell to their children as often as they fell to their enemies. Myth mirrored politics. Politics mirrored myth, yet from blood creation. The droplets of Uranus's severed body struck the earth, and where they fell, new beings sprang forth. The Erinyes, the Furies, rose cloaked in shadow, and vengeance destined to hound oath-breakers and kinslayers until time itself grew old. The Gigantes, the giants massive and ferocious, would one day challenge the gods in open war. And from the white foam, churned in the sea by Uranus's cast-off flesh, something beautiful, terrible, irresistible emerged Aphrodite. She stepped ashore, at Cyprus, radiant with desire, her smile as alluring as it was dangerous. Love itself, born from mutilation. Thus did blood and beauty arrive together, entwined like thorn and rose. To later poets, this paradox was the essence of Greek myth, from horror wonder, from violence love. Uranus, wounded and dethroned, retreated into the heavens, no longer a tyrant, but a memory his body stretched across the night as the sky itself. Yet even as he fled, he spoke a curse. Just as I was overthrown by my son, so too shall you, Cronus, be cast down by your own. It was less a prophecy than a truth, for the cycle of fear and rebellion is as old as the cosmos itself. Cronus took the throne of the cosmos, wrapping himself in the authority of the new age. His siblings, once cowed, now stood in awe. He had delivered Gaia from torment, freed his brothers from her womb, and claimed power. Yet the shadow of his father's curse clung to him like a second heartbeat. From the moment he held the sickle, Cronus already feared the hand that would one day wield it against him. The reign of Uranus, the first king of the cosmos, had ended. The age of the Titans had begun. But the pattern was set. Each ruler would rise upon the downfall of another. Each reign would carry within it the seed of its own ruin. And though the sky now arched freely above the earth, its stars cold and distant, the world below still trembled with the echoes of that first rebellion. With Uranus cast down, the world breathed anew. The vault of the sky no longer pressed upon the earth with suffocating weight. Gaia's groans eased, and the air stretched wider, freer. Into this space stepped Cronus, the youngest Titan, the cleverest, the one who had dared raise his hand against his father. The sickle of flint had won him not only vengeance for his mother, but dominion over the cosmos. And so began the reign of the Titans. It was in memory a golden age. Poets centuries later would look back upon it with longing, as if the earth itself had been kinder then, as if men and gods alike lived in a harmony unspoiled. Hesiod, whose verses still echo across time, described it as an era when mortals knew no toil. Crops sprang from the soil unbidden, the seasons bore fruit without hunger or drought, and humankind lived like gods themselves, free from suffering, untouched by age. When death came, it came softly, like sleep, and their spirits roamed the world as kindly guardians. But golden ages always live in hindsight. The truth of the Titans' rule was more complex. Cronus, though shrewd and capable, bore the weight of his father's curse in his chest. He could not forget Uranus's cry, nor the prophecy that one day he too would be struck down by his own child. His reign, for all its splendor, was haunted by that dread. Suspicion shadowed his every triumph. Fear clung like dew to the throne he had seized. Yet outwardly, the world flourished. Rhea, Cronus's sister and consort, walked at his side. She was gentler than he, a figure of patience and wisdom, her name whispered with reverence as the future mother of gods. Together, they governed a cosmos that for a time seemed balanced. Their siblings, Hyperion Themis, Oceanus Tethys, held their own realms, and the rivers, winds, and mountains took their places in the order of things. To the ancient Greeks, this Titan age reflected a yearning for simplicity. In their myths, the world had once been abundant and free of strife, as though before laws and armies there had been only natural order. It was a story of nostalgia, a memory of something never lived, but deeply needed, a time when doors had no locks, when hunger was unknown, when justice walked among mortals, unseen because none dared break it. Every farmer who bent his back in the rocky soil of Attica, every shepherd who lost his flock to wolves, felt the sting of contrast. Once the world was golden. Once it was better. But myths are rarely content with peace. In every golden age sleeps the seed of its own undoing. Cronus had brought liberation by cutting down his father, but liberation quickly hardened into tyranny of another kind. He was no longer son, no longer rebel. He was king. And kings in myth and history alike must guard their crowns jealously. The Titan king looked upon his realm with eyes clouded by suspicion. Where others saw children yet to be born, Cronus saw usurpers waiting in the womb. Where Rhea longed for family, he dreaded it. The sickle of flint, once his symbol of triumph, now hung over him like a shadow. He had learned from Uranus's downfall, but he had not learned the right lesson. Uranus had sought to bury his children to preserve his reign. Cronus would seek another method, darker still, And yet, in this moment, before paranoia hardened into cruelty, the Titan age shone like sunlight before a storm. It was remembered as the time when mortals lived close to gods, when rivers ran bright and clear, when fire had not yet been stolen, and sorrow had not yet entered Pandora's jar. Even today, the phrase Cronus's golden age lingers in memory, invoked by poets, philosophers, and dreamers as shorthand for paradise lost. The age of Titans was bright, yes, but fragile. Rhea's womb stirred. The first children of Cronus quickened, and with each heartbeat, the curse of Uranus whispered louder in the dark. Cronus knew what must come, and he was ready to do what even his father had not dared. The reign of Cronus, outwardly serene, was already fraying at its edges. The curse of Uranus haunted him like a whisper that would not fade. As I was overthrown by my son, so too shall you be. No Titan's feast, no song, no golden harvest could drown those words. Every time he looked upon Rhea, his sister and queen, he saw not only his consort, but the vessel of his doom. When her womb first quickened, Rhea was radiant. She longed for children daughters to braid garlands in her hair, sons to stride across the cosmos. But Cronus, staring into the shadows of prophecy, saw only rivals. And so, when the first child was born, he did what no father before him had dared. Hestia, goddess of the hearth, scarcely drew her first cry before Cronus seized her, and with jaws stretched wide swallowed her whole. There was no blood, no struggle, only the soft sound of a newborn's voice vanishing into silence. Rhea wept, but her tears fell unheard. Cronus told her it was necessary. He told her it was fate. The pattern continued. Demeter followed, and she too was devoured. Then Hera, sharp-eyed, even as an infant, was gulped down into her father's belly. Next came Hades, who would one day rule the underworld, but now was only a spark extinguished too soon. Poseidon was taken last, his small limbs writhing before the jaws closed. 5 times Rhea gave birth, and 5 times her children vanished into darkness. To Cronus, it was not cruelty, but caution. He believed he had outwitted destiny. By consuming his offspring, he reasoned he had locked the future away within himself. The curse could not strike if no heir lived to wield a blade. Each child trapped within his stomach was hidden as surely as Uranus had once buried his own children in Gaia's womb. History did not repeat itself, it rhymed. But Rhea's grief deepened with every loss. She was a goddess, yes, but also a mother. Imagine her arms empty again and again, the silence in her chambers, the laughter that never came. She wept in secret, her tears soaking the stone floors, her heart breaking beneath the weight of futility. She began to resent her husband's gaze, his fear disguised as authority. And yet she endured until the 6th child. When she felt Zeus stir within her, something changed. Perhaps it was desperation. Perhaps it was love stronger than fear. Perhaps it was Gaia herself, whispering from the depths, guiding her daughter as she once guided Cronus. Whatever the reason, Rhea resolved she would not lose this one. She fled to Crete, far from Cronus's watchful eyes, to a cave beneath Mount Ida, where shepherds tended their flocks and nymphs kept vigil. There in secret, she gave birth to Zeus. The air itself seemed to tremble at his cry. His eyes opened before his first breath, clear and bright, and when his tiny hand gripped Rhea's finger, it did so with the strength of fate itself. To deceive Cronus, Rhea wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes. With trembling hands, she placed the false infant in his arms. Greedy with fear, Cronus swallowed it whole without pause. He never noticed the difference, never imagined that destiny might trick him with such simplicity. He believed the danger had passed, his throne secured. But beneath Mount Ida, the true child nursed in secret, nymphs, rocked him. The goat Amalthea fed him milk that brimmed with vitality, and the curate's armored guardians danced and clashed their shields to drown out the sound of his cries, lest Cronus hear the truth carried on the wind. Each clang of bronze was a lullaby, each strike of shield upon shield a promise that fate had not been thwarted, only delayed. And so the balance of the cosmos shifted quietly. Cronus sat upon his throne, certain of his safety, while in a cave of Crete, a child grew, one destined to break his father, as surely as Cronus had broken Uranus. The cycle was not ended. It had only just begun. Hidden away in the rugged folds of Mount Ida, the child who would one day shake Olympus grew in silence. While Cronus feasted in his halls, smug in the belief that he had devoured every threat Zeus nursed on the milk of the divine goat Amalthea. She was no ordinary beast. Her horns curved like crescents of ivory. Her eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and her milk poured with a richness that strengthened gods. From her broken horn, torn either by accident or omen, flowed the cornucopia, the horn of plenty, forever brimming with food and drink. Even in myth, abundance was born from sacrifice. The cave was both cradle and fortress. Nymphs wrapped the infant in soft wool, and shepherds brought offerings in secret. Around him, the curates kept their ceaseless watch. These armored guardians, half priests, half warriors, stamped their feet and clashed their shields in a deafening rhythm. To mortals, their dance would seem mad, a frenzied pounding of bronze against bronze, but to Rhea it was salvation. Every clang drowned out the wail of her infant son, masking him from Cronus's ears. The sound was not only protection, but prophecy war, was already in Zeus's lullaby. As the boy grew, he drank in the world not from scrolls or tutors, but from the silence of mountains and the whisper of pines. He traced constellations with infant eyes, watched eagles soar above ravines, and listened as streams carved their songs into stone. Nature was his first teacher, wild and impartial. When storms lashed the peaks, he learned the voice of thunder. When goats scrambled across jagged cliffs, he learned balance and swiftness. The mountain shaped him into more than a child, it made him a force. The Greeks often looked at Zeus's secret childhood and saw echoes of other legends. Heroes in their stories were rarely raised in courts of comfort. They were hidden, abandoned, or exiled. Moses set afloat on the Nile Romulus, and Remus suckled by a wolf, Oedipus carried away from Thebes. To be chosen by fate was to be removed from the ordinary, to grow strong in solitude, to be tempered in danger, before ever wielding a crown. Zeus's childhood in Crete was not an accident, it was initiation. And through all this, Gaia herself stirred. She had guided Rhea just as she once guided Cronus, and she watched as the child of prophecy gained strength. In the soil beneath Mount Ida, her ancient voice whispered to the boy in dreams. She told him of his siblings swallowed into darkness of the prison, where the Cyclopes and the 100-handed ones still groaned of the sickle buried in the earth. Her words were not commands, but seeds planted deep in Zeus's spirit seeds that would one day burst into rebellion. As he came of age, Zeus's bearing already marked him as more than mortal. His eyes, sharp and storm-colored, seemed to see farther than the horizon. His shoulders carried the weight of inevitability, as though he knew, even before action, that the world awaited his hand. The nymphs whispered that his grip could bend wood, that sparks danced at his fingertips when he laughed, that when he cried out in anger, clouds gathered as though to answer. Meanwhile, far away in the halls of Cronus time marched on. The Titan king sat uneasily upon his throne, haunted by half-forgotten dreams. He had rid himself of children, yes, but still he felt shadows stir in his belly, as if the swallowed gods shifted in uneasy sleep. He drank deep of his triumph, but the taste was ash on his tongue. In quiet moments, he remembered his father's curse, and wondered if perhaps prophecy could not be swallowed as easily as a stone. And so the world waited caught between two generations, a father clutching power with fearful jaws, and a son growing strong in secret, tutored by mountains, nursed by myth, and guarded by a mother's desperate cunning. The sky stretched wide and silent, the earth brooded beneath, and in a cave of Crete, the storm god of the future opened his eyes to destiny. When Zeus grew to manhood, the whispers of Gaia ripened into command. The time of hiding had ended. The son of Rhea, raised in secrecy, was no longer a child swaddled in wool, but a storm given flesh. He carried within him not only strength, but cunning, and both would be needed against Cronus, the king who had swallowed his own heirs, the father who ruled with fear, lodged in his throat. The first blow was struck not with a thunderbolt, but with a cup. Guided by Medes, the titaness of wisdom, Zeus approached Cronus in disguise. He offered wine sweetened with a hidden draught, a potion designed not to kill, but to unseal. Cronus, suspicious, yet thirsty, drank. The liquid burned down his throat, thick as honey, but heavy with compulsion. Moments later, the Titan king shuddered. His jaw stretched wide, and from his gut rose the cries he thought silenced forever. One by one, the swallowed gods returned, not infants, but fully grown and radiant. Hestia, goddess of hearth and flame. Demeter, bearer of harvest. Hera, proud and unyielding. Hades, shadow-eyed lord of death. Poseidon, master of the surging deep. They emerged gleaming reborn in the fire of their father's undoing. At last, Zeus stood, not alone, but with 5 siblings at his side. For the first time, the children of Rhea faced their father together. Cronus, though shaken, was not without allies. The other Titans, his brothers and sisters, gathered at Mount Othrys, their ancient stronghold. Coeus, Creus, Hyperion, and Iapetus raised their colossal arms, their voices shaking the earth. Only Oceanus, the encircling river, held back too wise or too weary to fight. The lines were drawn on one side, the elder generation ancient as stone. On the other, the young Olympians, fierce with prophecy and hunger for rule. The war began, and it raged for 10 years without pause. To mortals below, it must have seemed as though the heavens themselves had split open. Lightning seared the skies. Seas swallowed coastlines in furious waves. Mountains cracked and bled, fire rivers boiled, and winds howled like wolves across the plains. The world was young still, and this war was its adolescence, a violence necessary to forge identity. At first, the Titans held the advantage. They were older, vast, and unrelenting. From Mount Othrys, their roars carried like avalanches, their strikes like earthquakes. The Olympians perched upon Mount Olympus, fought with desperation, but lacked the power to land the final blow. For years, the struggle dragged on neither side, yielding the world itself, scarred by their battles. But Gaia, ever watchful, whispered again. She told Zeus that victory could not be won without freeing those still imprisoned in Tartarus. Deep beneath the earth, in chains forged by Cronus's fear, the Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires lay waiting. Their strength had been wasted, their fury caged. If Zeus was to tip the balance, he must descend into that abyss and set them free. And so he did. With his siblings beside him, Zeus broke the gates of the underworld. Down into the choking dark, he went past rivers of fire and caverns of iron until he found them, the one-eyed smiths, their forges cold, the 100-handed giants, their muscles bound in fetters. With a cry that shook the stones, Zeus shattered their chains. The Cyclopes in gratitude gave him weapons of terrible might. To Zeus, they gifted the thunderbolt blazing with storm. To Poseidon, the trident sharp enough to shatter cliffs and command the sea. To Hades, the helm of invisibility, a shadow that could cloak him even from the gaze of gods. And the Hecatoncheires, now unbound, rose, with their 100 arms hurling mountains like pebbles, battering the Titans with the fury of ages restrained. The tide turned. Olympus thundered with new power. Zeus hurled bolts that split sky and sea. Poseidon churned oceans into towering walls. Hades vanished into shadow to strike unseen. The 100-handed ones tore through Titan ranks, their blows like storms of stone. Cronus fought with desperate might, his sickle flashing still, but prophecy gnawed at his heart with every strike. He had overthrown his father. Now his son would overthrow him. The cycle had come again, merciless and unbroken. At last, the Titans fell. One by one, they were hurled into Tartarus, bound in chains behind bronze gates that would never rust. Their groans echoed through the abyss, muffled but eternal. Only a few escaped that prison, Prometheus and Epimetheus, who had sided with Zeus, and Themis, who foresaw the justice of the Olympian rule. The rest were cast down. Their reign ended, their names swallowed by shadow. The war was over. The sky cleared, though scarred, and the seas calmed, though restless. The earth exhaled, though her soil was heavy with ash. Above it all, on Mount Olympus, Zeus stood crowned, not by inheritance, but by victory. He had not merely claimed the throne, he had earned it in fire and storm. Yet even in triumph, shadows lingered. Cronus's curse had not died with his chains. It followed Zeus, a reminder carved into the bones of the cosmos, that every king is only temporary. Every reign already carries the seed of its downfall. For power, once seized, must always be watched, and no ruler god or mortal sits secure forever. The war had ended, but in its wake lay silence. The Titans were bound in Tartarus, their screams muffled by bronze and shadow. The Olympians stood among the ruins of a battered cosmos, victorious yet unsettled. For 10 years, they had fought side by side, their weapons blazing, their wills entwined. But now, the question loomed. How would the world be ruled? Zeus, as eldest son in spirit, if not in birth, had led the charge, yet his siblings stood as equals in victory. There was no throne carved in stone awaiting them, no crown gleaming in the sun. The world itself had to be divided, its vastness carved like a prize of war. And here, in the uncertain hush after conquest, destiny gave way to choice. The brothers gathered Zeus, Poseidon, Hades upon the smoking ground where earth and sky had nearly torn apart. The sisters, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, looked on their voices less clamorous, but no less weighty, for their spheres of power would shape humanity's daily breath. Yet the great division fell to the three who had received the Cyclops' gifts. Zeus held the thunderbolt in his hand, its sparks still burning from the war. His gaze turned skyward to the endless dome above where clouds drifted and storms brewed. Poseidon rested his trident on the earth, and the soil beneath trembled as if it recognized him. His eyes wandered to the horizon, where sea met sky, the rolling waves, whispering promises of dominion. Hades, silent and grim, fingered the dark helm that concealed him even now. His glance turned downward, as though he could see into the hidden depths of the underworld. It was not a decision they could make with mere words. To claim the cosmos outright would invite suspicion and resentment. And so, by Zeus's suggestion, they cast lots. A game of chance to determine the fates of gods, a gesture as old as the dice cast by mortals at a tavern table. But here, chance was destiny, and destiny was law. The lots fell, and with them the world was carved. To Zeus went the heavens, the wide sky, the clouds, the thunder, the lightning. He would reign from Olympus, enthroned in the high air, watching the deeds of both gods and mortals beneath. To Poseidon went the seas, the restless waves, and hidden depths, the trident giving him command over storms and earthquakes alike. To Hades fell the underworld, dark and silent, the kingdom of the dead, where all souls must pass. The division was not equal in splendor. To mortals, Zeus's realm seemed brightest, Poseidon's most restless, Hades's most grim. Yet to the gods themselves, the balance was perfect. Each brother gained dominion fitting his nature. Zeus's ambition matched the vastness of the sky. Poseidon's fury matched the turbulence of the sea. Hades's patience matched the silence of the grave. Still there was unease. For though Zeus reigned as king, his brothers were not his vassals. They were sovereign in their own domains, bound by blood and oath, but not by chains. The seeds of rivalry lay hidden in their bargain like coals beneath ash, ready to flare when pride or grievance demanded. The Greeks would later say that all storms at sea were Poseidon's resentment, all shadows at death's door, Hades's quiet vengeance, and all thunder Zeus's assertion of dominion. The sisters, too, took their places. Hestia kept the hearth the fire at the center of every home, quiet but eternal. Demeter ruled the harvest, the grain the seasons, giving mankind its sustenance. Hera, fierce and regal, stood beside Zeus as his queen, though her power was her own, fierce as any thunderbolt. Together, the siblings formed a council unlike any the world had seen. No longer Titans, but Olympians. 12 thrones for 12 rulers each, a force each a story. From the smoking ruin of war, a new order emerged. The Titans had been driven into darkness, their time ended. The world now belonged to these younger gods, whose voices would shape mountains, seas, and skies. From Olympus, they would reign not in silence, but in constant drama alliances, betrayals, loves, and vengeance. For if Cronus's reign had been heavy with fear, the reign of Zeus would be heavy with passion. And passion, unlike fear, cannot be contained. The cosmos was divided, but the world was not at peace. In every wave, every shadow, every roll of thunder, the memory of that division lived on a reminder that even among gods, unity is fragile, and power is never free of cost. The lots had been cast, the world divided, and the Titans hurled into Tartarus. But a kingdom is not simply seized, it must be built. The Olympians, newly crowned by fate and victory, now faced the task of shaping a dominion worthy of their power. And so, they turned their eyes to the mountain that would become their throne Olympus. Unlike Othrys, the cold and stony fortress of the Titans, Olympus was no bleak bastion of fear. Rising high above Thessaly, its slopes brushed the clouds, its summit veiled in mists that glowed with morning fire. To mortals gazing from below, it seemed a mountain without end, a stairway into the very sky. But to the gods, it was more than stone. It was sanctuary palace and theater of eternity. Upon its heights, the gods erected halls of gleaming marble, radiant as dawn. Columns rose like forest trunks capped with golden beams. Floors shone as if washed by sunlit rivers, and great gates opened to reveal courts vast enough for storms to gather. This was no fortress for war, but a citadel for rule, a place where laughter, rage, and decree would echo in equal measure. Here, the gods built 12 thrones, each shaped to the essence of its occupant. Zeus's throne gleamed with the fire of thunderbolts, the very air around it restless with sparks. Hera's throne was wrought with ivory and gold, carved with peacocks and lilies regal and unyielding. Poseidon's was of deep green stone, etched with waves that seemed to ripple and crash when touched by light. Hades's throne, though he seldom came, was of obsidian dark and cold as the cavernous deep. The thrones of the others completed the circle, Demeter's decked in sheaves of grain, Hestia's glowing with a gentle hearth flame, Apollo's blazing like the sun, Artemis's cool as moonlit silver, Athena's gleaming with the edge of a bronze spear. Ares's throne bore the scars of battle, while Aphrodite's shone like polished seashells perfumed with roses. Hermes's rested lightly wings, carved upon its arms, as though it might fly away at whim. Together, They formed not only a council, but a family of powers, each one distinct yet bound by the shared seat of Olympus. Mortals began to whisper of them, as the Olympians a name that grew into awe and worship. They were not like the Titans, distant and unyielding, but closer, more entangled with human lives. They fell in love, they quarreled, they betrayed, they blessed. Mortals saw in them not just rulers, but mirrors of their own passions, magnified, eternal, unrestrained. And so temples began to rise. From Crete to Delphi, from Athens to Sparta, stones were lifted in their honor, sacrifices burned, hymns sung. The smoke of offerings wound upward like cords tying the fate of mortals to the caprice of gods. Olympus, however, was no utopia. It was a court, and courts are always rife with rivalries. Hera, proud and jealous, watched Zeus's wandering eye with fury that would haunt countless generations of heroes. Poseidon, though sovereign of the sea, never ceased to chafe beneath Zeus's crown, his trident restless as the tides. Hades, who received the underworld by lot, grew ever more solitary, his visits rare, his kingdom grim, but orderly. And the younger gods, bright as dawn, began to test the boundaries of their domains, eager to carve legacies of their own. From their thrones they ruled. But Olympus was not merely a palace, it was a stage. Every quarrel, every alliance, every betrayal played out upon it, woven into the fabric of myth. And as the seasons turned, mortals learned to read the moods of their rulers in the changes of the world: thunder for Zeus's wrath, famine for Demeter's grief, waves for Poseidon's anger, eclipses for Apollo and Artemis at odds. The rise of Olympus was not the end of strife, but the beginning of a new era. For in establishing their thrones, the Olympians did not bring peace, they brought drama, unending, immortal. And from that drama, the myths of Greece would spill, shaping poetry, tragedy, and song for all the ages that followed. The gods had secured their thrones, carved the world into realms, and raised Olympus as their shining seat. But their reign could not be complete without subjects, creatures, to till the earth, honor the gods, and echo their passions in mortal form. And so came the age of men, the shaping of humanity itself. In the earliest tellings, mortals did not exist until the gods in their new dominion chose to fashion them. Prometheus, the Titan, spared from Tartarus for his cunning, and foresight took upon himself the task. With hands skilled as a sculptor's, he molded clay into figures, breathing into them the spark of life. Beside him stood his brother Epimetheus, less wise, more careless, who distributed gifts of strength, speed, and cunning to the beasts of the world. To men, however, he left nothing. Naked, frail, defenseless mankind entered the earth with no fur against the cold, no claws for the hunt, no wings to flee. It was Prometheus who pitied them. He saw in mortals a fragility that mirrored the gods' own hidden wounds, the memory of war, the precariousness of power. And so he gave them more reason-craft memory. He taught them to shape tools from stone, to plow the soil, to build shelters against storm. But his greatest gift was fire stolen from Olympus itself. In secret, he carried the flame in a hollow reed, placing it into mortal hands. With it, men cooked their food, hardened their weapons, forged their cities. Fire was warmth light, and defiance a spark that allowed mortals to stand upright against the dark. When Zeus beheld this, his wrath thundered. Mortals born of clay now wielded fire, the very essence of divine power. It was theft, insolence, rebellion in miniature. For if men possessed fire, they could one day challenge the gods. And Zeus, who had overthrown his own father, feared rebellion above all things. His vengeance was swift. He ordered Hephaestus, the divine smith, to fashion a being of beauty and doom, Pandora. From earth and water she was formed, her face sculpted with perfect grace. Athena clothed her in silken robes. Aphrodite crowned her with allure. Hermes placed in her heart a voice of charm and deception. To mankind she was given as a gift, the first woman radiant and beguiling. But she carried with her a vessel of secrets, a curse in disguise. When the jar was opened, whether by chance or by curiosity, the world was forever changed. Out flew sickness, toil hunger, and sorrow, scattering across the earth like locusts. War and plague followed suffering woven into mortal fate. Only hope remained within the vessel, a faint light flickering against endless shadow. Thus, the birth of mortals was both blessing and punishment. They were given life fire and reason, yet bound to hardship, forever beneath the gaze of gods, who could aid or ruin them with a whim. To the Olympians, men were both playthings and petitioners, creatures whose songs and sacrifices fed divine pride, yet whose defiance could never be fully extinguished. From that moment, humanity's story began not as masters of their fate, but as beings suspended between clay and flame suffering, and hope forever looking upward to Olympus. And the gods, for all their majesty, would never cease to entangle themselves in mortal affairs, drawn to the mirror of their own passions in the fragile lives below. There comes a moment in the Greek imagination when the gods, though still omnipotent, begin to recede, just slightly, allowing a new breed of figure to emerge, the mortal who is not entirely mortal, the human touched by the spark of divinity. This was the Age of Heroes, a time said to come after the Age of Gods, but before the ordinary world of men, a golden interlude when demigods, champions, and larger-than-life kings strode across the earth. For the Greeks, the heroic age served as both history and myth. These were the stories they told to explain not only where their ancestors came from, but what qualities were most admired and feared in human nature. Unlike the gods, heroes suffered, bled, and died. Yet unlike ordinary mortals, their deeds left echoes that resonated for generations. They stood as proof that human striving could brush against the eternal, even if at great cost. At the forefront of this age was Heracles, perhaps the most famous hero of all. Born to Zeus and the mortal woman Alcmene, his very life was defined by divine meddling. Hera's hatred ensured that Heracles would face suffering at every turn, but it was precisely this relentless testing that made him the model of strength and endurance. His 12 labors, slaying the Nemean lion, capturing the Ceryneian hind, cleansing the Augean stables, were not just adventures, but metaphors for the seemingly impossible tasks that humans must endure to purify themselves. In Heracles, the Greeks saw both the cost and the glory of heroism, triumph earned through suffering, divinity gained through toil. Yet Heracles was not alone. Another figure loomed almost as large, Perseus, slayer of Medusa. His tale combined divine gifts and mortal courage. Sent on an impossible quest, he carried Athena's shield and Hermes' winged sandals into the lair of the Gorgons. Perseus' triumph was not simply a monster's death, but the promise that wit and courage could triumph over horror itself. And his reward was not just survival, but legacy-founding dynasties, shaping kingdoms, ensuring his bloodline would echo through history. Then there was Theseus, the Athenian hero, who embodied cleverness and civic duty. His battle with the Minotaur in the labyrinth was one of the most enduring myths of all. With a ball of thread gifted by Ariadne, he unraveled not just the maze, but the balance of fear that had haunted Athens. Theseus represented the cunning, resourceful man who united strength with intellect. Later, his role as a unifier of Attica into the city-state of Athens gave his story political weight, myth, as a justification for empire legend, as the underpinning of civic pride. But the Age of Heroes was not merely about individuals. It was also about collective struggles that bound them together. Nowhere is this clearer than in the saga of the Trojan War, the crown jewel of heroic mythology. In this single conflict, nearly every great hero of Greece was gathered. Achilles, with his godlike speed and his tragic heel. Hector, noble prince of Troy, who fought not for glory, but for family and city. Odysseus wily and patient, whose stratagem of the Trojan horse brought victory. Agamemnon, whose pride poisoned unity. Paris, whose choice of Aphrodite's bribe set the entire war in motion. The Trojan War became the great canvas of the heroic age, a stage where love, pride, vengeance, and destiny collided. In Homer's Iliad, the war is not just about spears and ships, but about what it means to be mortal in the shadow of eternity. Heroes like Achilles wrestled with the knowledge that their lives would be brief, but remembered forever, while a long, quiet life would leave them forgotten. This tension between the fleeting spark of existence and the desire for lasting fame was the very heart of heroism. And yet, even in triumph, the heroes were not spared suffering. Achilles gained eternal glory, but died young. Agamemnon returned home, only to be murdered by his wife. Ajax fell into madness and despair. Odysseus endured years of wandering before reclaiming his throne. The Age of Heroes was as much a tale of loss as of victory, underscoring that the line between greatness and ruin was perilously thin. It is worth noting that the Greeks did not see these figures as flawless paragons. Their heroes were stubborn, vengeful, sometimes cruel. Achilles could be petty, refusing to fight over a slight to his honor. Theseus abandoned Ariadne, his savior, on a lonely shore. Heracles, in a fit of madness sent by Hera, killed his own family. These flaws were not footnotes, they were central. The Greeks understood that greatness often came with darkness, that human excellence was bound up with human frailty. To be a hero was not to be perfect, but to live in the extremes of strength, of passion, of tragedy. As time passed, the Greeks even wove genealogies that linked their noble houses to these heroes. Kings claimed descent from Perseus, or Heracles' cities traced their founding to heroic exploits. In this way, the Age of Heroes served not just as myth, but as a kind of charter for power, a sacred history that legitimized rule and gave identity to whole communities. By the end of the heroic age, the gods themselves seemed to retreat further, leaving men to their fates. The heroes had bridged the gap, mortals, who touched divinity demigods, who suffered like mortals. Their stories reminded the Greeks that greatness was always possible, but never free. It demanded sacrifice, risk, and often pain. And so the Age of Heroes lingered in Greek memory, not as a simple past, but as a mirror reflecting the beauty and terror of human striving. To tell of Heracles, of Achilles, of Theseus, was to ask what it means to chase greatness and what price one is willing to pay for glory that outlives the flesh. If there was ever a stage upon which all the threads of Greek mythology converged, it was the Trojan War. To the Greeks, this was not merely a war. It was the war, the great conflict that defined an age where gods, heroes, and mortals collided in a storm of passion, vengeance, and destiny. It was their cultural epicenter, the story from which countless poems, plays, and songs were born. The roots of the Trojan War lay not in strategy or politics, but in something achingly human, a quarrel over beauty. The story begins at a wedding, specifically that of Peleus and the sea goddess Thetis. All the gods were invited, save for one, Eris, the goddess of discord. Furious at the slight, she hurled into the feast a golden apple inscribed with 3 words that would shake the ancient world to the fairest. Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite each claimed it. Zeus, ever wary of direct involvement in such quarrels, passed the decision to Paris, a Trojan prince tending sheep on Mount Ida. Here, the gods entangled mortals in their rivalries. Hera promised power, Athena promised wisdom and victory in war, and Aphrodite promised the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris chose Aphrodite, and thus won Helen of Sparta. Never mind that she was already the wife of King Menelaus. When Helen was spirited away to Troy, whether by seduction or abduction, depends on which poet you read, the Greeks had their pretext for war. And so the kings and heroes bound by oaths launched 1,000 ships to reclaim her, as the poet later wrote. The war was a theater of personalities larger than life and endlessly complex. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, led the coalition of Greek forces, but his pride and arrogance often undermined unity. His brother Menelaus was the wronged husband, driven less by love than by wounded honor. The cunning Odysseus tried at first to avoid the war, feigning madness, but was compelled to join and became indispensable with his stratagems. Then there was Achilles, the blazing star of the war, whose wrath and brilliance on the battlefield made him both the Greeks' greatest hope and their greatest danger. The Trojans, too, had champions who were no less noble. Priam, their aged king, ruled with dignity, while his son, Hector, embodied the very ideal of a warrior. Hector was no demigod, touched by divine parentage, but rather a man of duty, courage, and loyalty, fighting not for fame, but for family and city. In him, the Greeks recognized a hero whose nobility rivaled their own. The war dragged on for 10 long years, not because of indecisive strategy, but because it was in essence a clash of egos and divine schemes. The gods themselves took sides. Hera and Athena favored the Greeks, while Aphrodite and Apollo favored the Trojans. Even Zeus, despite his efforts at neutrality, could not resist tipping the balance from time to time. Battles on the plain before Troy were mirrored by arguments on Olympus, as gods quarreled and conspired like mortals with thunder at their disposal. Among the countless episodes, certain scenes burned themselves into cultural memory. The duel between Menelaus and Paris, meant to end the war, swiftly collapsed into chaos when Aphrodite spirited Paris away in a cloud of mist. The wrath of Achilles, provoked by Agamemnon's insult in seizing his war prize, Briseis led to his withdrawal from battle, an absence that nearly cost the Greeks the war. The killing of Patroclus, Achilles' beloved companion, by Hector, spurred Achilles back into the fight, his rage a force as devastating as any god's wrath. When Achilles and Hector finally met in single combat, the world seemed to pause. Hector fought with dignity, but Achilles was unstoppable, driven by grief and fury. Hector's death sealed Troy's doom, even if the city's fall would take years more. And then came one of the most haunting moments of all: the old King Priam slipping into the enemy's camp at night, kneeling before Achilles to beg for his son's body. The mighty warrior killer of Hector was moved to tears. For a brief moment, vengeance gave way to shared humanity. The war, after all, was not just about glory, but about fathers' sons, grief, and the endless cycle of loss. Yet Troy did not fall through battle alone. It fell through deception, the infamous Trojan horse. Tired of stalemate, Odysseus devised a stratagem, a colossal wooden horse, seemingly an offering to Athena, left as a gift after the Greeks pretended to abandon the siege. Against the warnings of the prophetess Cassandra and the priest Laocoon, the Trojans brought the horse within their walls. At night, Greek warriors hidden inside emerged, opened the gates, and the city was overrun. Troy, proud and unyielding, for a decade burned in a single night of horror. The aftermath was as tragic as the war itself. Priam was slain at the altar. Hector's infant son, Astyanax, was hurled from the walls to prevent future vengeance. Women like Andromache and Hecuba were taken as slaves. Even Helen, the cause of it all, returned with Menelaus. Her beauty undiminished, her fate as enigmatic as ever. For the Greeks, The Trojan War was not simply a legend, it was a lens through which they understood the nature of existence. The war showed how desire could ignite catastrophe, how pride could destroy nations, and how even the mightiest heroes were subject to fate. To tell of Troy was to tell of humanity at its most exalted and most fragile. In its echoes, the Trojan War became the foundation of Western literature. The Iliad and Odyssey of Homer, the tragedies of Euripides, the epics of later poets all drew from this inexhaustible well. To the Greeks, the war was not a single event in the past, but a living memory, a cautionary tale, and an endless source of inspiration. It was their defining story, the epic of epics, the war to end all wars, forever retold around firelight in marble halls and on the tragic stage. The fall of Troy did not end with triumph and feasting. For many of the heroes, their homecoming would prove longer and darker than the war itself. Among them, none bore greater suffering than Odysseus, king of rocky Ithaca, whose tale was sung not only as an adventure, but as a meditation on endurance, longing, and the inexorable will of the gods. His wanderings would last 10 years, beyond the 10 already spent at Troy, until his name became inseparable from the very idea of the journey. Odysseus was not like Achilles, famed for brute strength, nor like Ajax, towering and straightforward. His weapon was always cunning, his tongue sharp as his spear. The wooden horse, the ruse that had broken Troy, was his invention. Yet cleverness, as the Greeks often believed, invited envy from the gods. His fate turned dark when he crossed Poseidon, lord of the sea, by blinding the Cyclops Polyphemus, Poseidon's own son. For that act, Poseidon swore Odysseus would wander the seas without rest, his nostrils filled with brine and his heart aching for home. The journey began with temptations that threatened to erode the will of his men. On the island of the Lotus Eaters, the crew tasted flowers that robbed them of memory and desire, leaving them adrift in dreamy forgetfulness. Odysseus, dragging them back to the ships, reminded them and us that the greatest danger on the road home was often not monsters, but the forgetting of what one loves. Then came the cavern of Polyphemus, where men were trapped like lambs in a pen. The Cyclops devoured them raw one by one. Here, Odysseus's brilliance saved them. He called himself, nobody offered wine to the brute, and drove a sharpened stake into the monster's single eye. When Polyphemus cried for help, he wailed that nobody was hurting him, and so his brothers ignored him. It was triumph, yet also hubris, for as Odysseus sailed away, he shouted his true name, inviting Poseidon's vengeance. That moment, half pride and half curse defined his voyage. Victories always bought at a terrible price. The sea flung him from wonder to terror. Aeolus, keeper of the winds, once gifted him a bag containing every gale that blew across the earth. Ithaca lay already within sight when his crew, greedy and suspicious, untied it, loosing storms that hurled them back into the open sea. On Circe's island, his men were transformed into swine until Odysseus, protected by Hermes' herb, confronted the sorceress and won her aid. For a year, they lingered in her halls, feasting, while the memory of home grew faint. Yet eventually, he sailed again, guided now by warnings of the trials ahead. Perhaps the most haunting of these came at the edge of the world itself, where Odysseus descended into Hades. In the gloom of the underworld, he spoke with the prophet Tiresias, who foretold his return, but also of blood yet to be shed in Ithaca. He met the shades of Achilles, lamenting that even glory in life could not outweigh the shadowy fate of the dead, and of Agamemnon, murdered by his wife, a grim reminder that even homecomings could end in betrayal. The voyage onward brought scenes etched deep into memory. The sirens sang irresistible songs that promised wisdom and delight, luring sailors to crash upon the rocks. Odysseus, bound to the mast, strained against his ropes, yearning to leap into the sea, while his men rowed, with ears stopped by wax. Between Scylla and Charybdis, he faced the cruelest choice: to risk all to the whirlpool, or to lose only a few to the 6 snapping heads of the monster. He steered towards Scylla, and the cries of his devoured men haunted him ever after. After further storms and shipwrecks, Odysseus was stranded on Ogygia, the island of the nymph Calypso. For 7 long years, she kept him as her lover, promising him immortality and eternal youth if he would stay. Many men would have accepted, but Odysseus's heart clung to Penelope, his faithful wife, and to Telemachus, the son who had grown from boy to man in his absence. At last, even the gods took pity, and Hermes commanded Calypso to release him. Yet Poseidon had not finished. Odysseus built a raft, only to have it shattered by storms. He clung to broken planks until the Phaeacians, a noble seafaring people, took him in and, moved by his story, gave him passage home. When at last he reached Ithaca's shores, he did not rush openly to his palace. Instead, Athena cloaked him in the disguise of a beggar, for suitors had overrun his hall, feasting on his herds and pressing Penelope to remarry. The climax was both brutal and poetic. Penelope, ever cunning, set the test of the bow, Odysseus's great bow, which none but he could string. Disguised still, he bent it with ease, and revealing himself, loosed arrows that cut down the suitors where they sat. By his side stood Telemachus, proving himself his father's son in battle. When at last Penelope welcomed him, it was not blindly, but after testing him with her own trick, she asked him to move their bed, and Odysseus, outraged, revealed the secret that it was rooted in a living olive tree, immovable. Only then did she embrace him, husband restored. The Odyssey is more than a tale of monsters and storms. It is a meditation on the human condition, the pull of desire against duty, the temptation to forget the cost of pride, and the unyielding power of longing for home. Odysseus did not return a god or a conqueror. He returned as a scarred, weary man who had endured. And in that endurance, the Greeks saw themselves voyagers upon uncertain seas, striving always to hold fast to memory, to love, and to home. As the dust of war settled and the heroic age drifted into legend, Greece found another vessel for its myths, the theater. What had once been sung by bards beneath flickering firelight or whispered during rituals was now given shape in amphitheaters cut into the living rock of the hills. Here, under open skies and before thousands of eyes, the stories of gods and mortals were staged, reshaped, and given new life. The roots of drama grew from ritual. Each spring in Athens, citizens gathered for festivals dedicated to Dionysus, god of wine, ecstasy, and metamorphosis. What began as choral hymns to the god-wild ecstatic songs sung by men in masks slowly developed into dialogue, plot, and character. From this soil sprouted tragedy, comedy, and satyr play, 3 branches of drama that together reflected the spectrum of human experience, from grief to laughter, from reverence to ridicule. The setting itself was sacred. Theaters were not mere buildings, but sanctuaries, extensions of the temples. The theater of Dionysus in Athens could hold up to 15,000 people, an entire city gathering as one body to witness stories of their ancestors and their gods. The chorus chanted in unison, drums pounded, flutes wailed, and masked actors, looming larger than life, with their stylized expressions, spoke lines heavy with fate. To attend was not leisure, but duty and active citizenship. In tragedy, Athenians did not simply watch. They reflected on what it meant to be human. Aeschylus, often called the father of tragedy, wove together the first great tapestries of myth on stage. His Oresteia trilogy recounted the grim aftermath of the Trojan War. Agamemnon, returning victorious, was murdered by his wife Clytemnestra as vengeance for the daughter he had sacrificed. Their son Orestes then hunted his mother in turn, driven by the Furies, the relentless spirits of blood vengeance. The cycle of violence seemed unbreakable, until in the final play, the goddess Athena intervened, establishing trial by jury and ending blood feud with law. Aeschylus's plays were not just stories. They were meditations on justice, divine order, and the slow evolution of human society. Sophocles brought refinement and humanity. His characters were not archetypes alone, but flesh and blood figures, torn between duty and desire. In Oedipus, Rex, the king of Thebes, sought to purge his city of plague, only to uncover a horrifying truth: he himself was the curse, having unknowingly killed his father and married his mother. The power of the play lay not in the revelation alone, but in the way Sophocles made the audience complicit in Oedipus's blindness. We too failed to see what was before us until it was too late. In Antigone, a young woman defied the king's decree to honor her dead brother, asserting that divine law stood above human edicts. Through such dramas, Sophocles forced Athenians to confront questions of loyalty, conscience, and the limits of power. Then came Euripides, the most radical of the tragedians. Where Aeschylus showed grandeur and Sophocles balance, Euripides exposed raw nerves. His heroine spoke with startling realism. Medea, betrayed by Jason, slew her own children to shatter his pride. In the Trojan, women survivors of Troy mourned as they were dragged into slavery, their lamentation echoing the very real suffering of war's aftermath. Euripides questioned the gods, sometimes portraying them as capricious or cruel, and dared to show women slaves and foreigners as voices of truth. Some Athenians found his work unsettling, even impious, yet his vision pierced deeper into the human condition than perhaps any of his peers. The structure of tragedy itself invited reflection. The chorus was not mere background. It was the voice of the community, sometimes guiding, sometimes bewildered, often echoing the audience's own doubts. The concept of catharsis, the purging of pity and fear through the experience of tragedy, became central. By watching Oedipus fall or Agamemnon bleed, Athenians confronted the fragility of their own lives, their own precarious balance with fate. Yet the Greeks did not dwell solely in darkness. Alongside tragedy, comedy flourished most famously through Aristophanes. His plays turned the world upside down, using satire to mock politicians, generals, philosophers, even the gods. In Lysistrata, women withheld intimacy from their husbands until the men agreed to end war. In the Clouds, Socrates was lampooned as a ridiculous sophist, floating in the air and twisting logic into absurdity. Aristophanes reminded Athenians that laughter too was a civic act, a way of questioning power, mocking hypocrisy, and restoring balance after the weight of tragedy. Between tragedy and comedy stood the satyr play, bawdy and irreverent, performed after the heaviness of a tragic trilogy. Dancers dressed as satyrs, half men, half goats, parodied heroic myths with drunken lechery and wild antics. These plays reassured the audience that life, even when dark, could still be laughed at. What made theater so central to Greece was its communal nature. In the amphitheater, farmers, merchants, aristocrats, and statesmen all sat together, witnessing the same story, bound by shared laughter and tears. The myths were not distant relics, but living conversations about justice, pride, love, and mortality. The plays provided a safe mirror in which Athenians could contemplate their wars, their politics, and their families. The influence of this theater spread far beyond Greece. Romans adopted and adapted it. Medieval Europe rediscovered it through translations. Modern theater still carries the pulse of Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes. Whenever actors step on stage to wrestle with human dilemmas before a crowd, the spirit of Dionysus lingers. The Greeks understood something timeless, that stories gain new life when spoken aloud, when embodied in voice and movement, when shared by a community in a single breath. Their theater was not simply entertainment, but a dialogue between the mortal and the divine, the individual and the city laughter and grief. In it, myth was not frozen in stone. It lived, it questioned, it changed. And through this living art, the people of Greece found both catharsis and continuity, carrying their oldest stories forward into every generation. Even as the chorus sang, and the actors declaimed beneath the Athenian sun, another transformation stirred quietly in the minds of philosophers. For centuries, myths had been told as literal truths. Zeus hurled lightning, Athena guided heroes, Hades ruled the underworld. But as Athens grew into the beating heart of Greek, thought voices rose that dared to ask whether these stories might mean more than they seemed. The philosophers were not content with surface. They sought patterns, lessons, and allegories hidden within the tales. To them, myths were not merely fanciful stories of gods and monsters, but coded reflections of nature, morality, and the human soul. Where the poets gave drama, the philosophers gave interpretation. The earliest attempts came from the physiologoi natural philosophers like Thales, Anaximander, and Heraclitus, who viewed myth as a symbolic way of speaking about the cosmos. To Heraclitus, for example, the thunderbolts of Zeus represented the eternal fire that structured the universe. The gods, he believed, were metaphors for elemental forces: Poseidon for water, Hades for earth, Apollo for fire. Myth, then, was poetry, cloaking philosophy. Later thinkers such as the Stoics carried this further. They argued that Zeus symbolized divine reason, the logos that ordered all things. Hera, his consort, embodied the air. Hephaestus, the creative fire. Aphrodite, the binding force of attraction in the cosmos. The struggles of gods mirrored the eternal conflicts within nature itself: chaos and order, desire and discipline, change and permanence. Thus, myth was not superstition, but a language through which the ancients had first grasped the order of the universe. Plato, ever skeptical of poets, wrestled with myth uneasily. In his dialogues, he often dismissed Homer for corrupting the youth with immoral depictions of gods behaving badly. Yet even Plato could not abandon myth entirely. When pure reason faltered, he turned to allegory. In the Republic, he crafted the myth of the cavemen chained in darkness, mistaking shadows for reality until one is freed and beholds the truth in the sunlight. Though not drawn from Homer or Hesiod, it was myth reborn, a story designed to reveal philosophical truth. In other works, Plato invented myths of the soul's journey after death, or the creation of the cosmos, using narrative to carry ideas reason alone could not bear. Aristotle, his student, approached myth more pragmatically. In his Poetics, he analyzed tragedy itself as a vehicle for understanding human nature. He identified catharsis, the purging of pity and fear, as the key purpose of tragic myth retold on stage. To Aristotle, myth was not sacred story, but structure, the skeleton of drama. He treated narrative with the cool eye of science, dissecting it, as one might dissect an animal to understand why it moved audiences so deeply. Meanwhile, allegorical interpretation flourished. The Orphics followers of mystical traditions tied to Orpheus read myths as veils covering profound truths about the soul's imprisonment in the body and its release through purification. In their reading, Dionysus's dismemberment by the Titans symbolized the scattering of divine essence within human flesh, a cosmic tragedy echoed in every mortal life. Myth became instruction for salvation, guiding believers through ritual toward reunion with the divine. Historians too weighed in. Euhemerus, a Hellenistic thinker, suggested that myths were distorted memories of real events that the gods themselves were once mortal kings, whose deeds had been exaggerated by time. This euhemeristic reading stripped Olympus of its divinity-grounding myth in human history. Zeus was no longer a thunder-wielding deity, but perhaps an ancient ruler remembered with awe. The multiplicity of these approaches revealed something vital. Myth was not fixed. It was a canvas upon which each generation painted its own meaning. To the dramatists, myth was tragedy and catharsis. To philosophers, it was allegory and argument. To mystics, it was revelation. To historians, it was memory. The same story, say Persephone's descent into the underworld, could be ritual for farmers' poetry, for tragedians, allegory for philosophers, and doctrine for mystery cults. This layered understanding allowed Greek mythology to endure even as reason flourished. For while the philosophers questioned the literal truth of Zeus or Apollo, they could not deny the story's power. Myths spoke to parts of the soul that logic alone could not reach. They gave shape to wonder, grief, and longing in ways syllogisms never could. Consider the myth of Prometheus. To Hesiod, it was a tale of a trickster punished for stealing fire. To Aeschylus, it became a tragedy of defiance, the Titan chained for giving humanity knowledge. To philosophers, Prometheus embodied the restless striving of reason, the spirit of human progress against divine limitation. Each retelling revealed a new dimension, showing how myth could evolve without losing its core. What began as stories to explain the inexplicable thunder-death harvest had become vessels for abstract thought. The Greeks discovered that myth was elastic, capable of bearing theology, science, psychology, and ethics. This flexibility ensured its survival. For even as religion shifted, empires fell, and new philosophies arose, the old stories could be reinterpreted, reframed, and retold. By the time of the Hellenistic Age, allegorical readings of myth had become so widespread that poets composed with dual purpose, entertaining the ear while stimulating the mind. The myths were no longer only tales of gods, but riddles to be solved, mirrors to be studied. When later cultures, Romans, Christians, Renaissance humanists encountered them, they too found in Greek myth not static superstition, but a treasury of symbols. In the end, philosophy did not destroy mythology. It deepened it. The philosophers taught Greece to look beneath the surface, to ask not only what happened to Oedipus or Orpheus, but why it mattered. They turned myth into a dialogue between imagination and intellect, between narrative and reason. And so, the myths endured. Not because every Greek believed Zeus literally thundered on Olympus, but because within the stories lay reflections of nature, society, and the self. Allegory gave myth a second life, ensuring it was never silenced, even in an age that demanded reason above all. When the last fires of the ancient world dimmed, and the marble of temples cracked beneath the weight of time, Greek myth did not vanish. Instead, it wandered like Odysseus himself through centuries and civilizations, reshaping itself wherever it went. Its gods no longer received sacrifices upon altars, but their names, their stories, and their symbols survived, woven into the fabric of cultures that came long after Hellas fell. The Romans were the first great heirs. To them, the Greek pantheon was too rich to ignore, and so they adopted it, wholesale, changing little but the names. Zeus became Jupiter. Hera became Juno. Poseidon became Neptune. The myths crossed the sea, settling into Latin verse. Virgil's Aeneid reshaped Homeric epic into Rome's founding story, tracing the hero Aeneas from the ashes of Troy to the birth of Rome. Ovid, in his Metamorphoses, spun Greek myths into a shimmering web of transformations, retelling stories of gods and mortals with a wit and elegance that ensured their survival in every library of Europe for the next 2 millennia. Through Rome, Greek myth became not just the inheritance of a single people, but the shared heritage of the West. With the rise of Christianity, one might expect the old myths to have been swept aside. Yet they lingered. Church fathers often railed against the immorality of pagan stories, Zeus's adulteries, Hera's vengeful cruelty, Aphrodite's wantonness, and yet, beneath condemnation, lay fascination. Some Christian thinkers borrowed allegorical methods developed by Greek philosophers interpreting myths as moral lessons or warnings against sin. Others preserved the stories unwittingly, copying texts that contained them. The gods may have been banished from temples, but they survived in manuscripts, in commentaries, in the whispered allusions of poets who could not forget the beauty of the old tales. Through the Middle Ages, myth went underground, surfacing in unexpected places. Monks illuminated manuscripts of Ovid. Scholars in Byzantium kept Homer alive. In the Islamic world, translations of Greek texts carried echoes of the myths into Arabic commentaries. Even when Europe seemed most devoted to Christian allegory, the old gods hid in the margins of art, in the metaphors of poets, in the strange persistence of their names for stars and planets. To gaze at the sky was to remember them: Jupiter, Venus, Mars, Mercury, Saturn. The heavens themselves bore witness to their endurance. Then came the Renaissance, and with it, rebirth. Humanists turned eagerly to Greek and Roman texts, finding in them not superstition, but beauty, wisdom, and a lost grandeur. Painters covered walls with scenes from mythology, Botticelli's Birth of Venus, Michelangelo's Leda, and the swan Titian's Europa. Sculptors carved gods and heroes anew, not as objects of worship, but as embodiments of ideal form and beauty. For artists and thinkers alike, myth offered a language for passion, for power, for the eternal dance between love and death. The Enlightenment, with its devotion to reason, might again have buried the myths. But instead, scholars like Johann Winckelmann praised Greek art and myth as the highest expression of human creativity. Poets such as Goethe, Keats, and Shelley reimagined myths as symbols of longing rebellion and tragic beauty. Prometheus, once punished for fire, became a symbol of human striving, of genius-defying tyranny. Orpheus became the artist whose song could nearly overcome death itself. The myths shifted again, carrying meanings suited to the new age. And so they continued reshaping themselves with each generation. Freud read Oedipus not as a king cursed by gods, but as the embodiment of unconscious desire. Jung found archetypes in Zeus, Aphrodite, and Hades' patterns of the psyche repeating across cultures. Philosophers, psychologists, and storytellers alike mined the myths for insight into the human condition. Myth became not just ancient history, but a mirror for the modern soul. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the myths surged into popular culture with renewed vigor. They strode across cinema screens, in epics, and fantasy films, reimagined in novels for children and adults alike. Heroes like Hercules, Perseus, and Achilles found new audiences, while gods of Olympus stood alongside superheroes in comics and blockbusters. Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson series reintroduced Greek mythology to millions of young readers, blending ancient figures with modern landscapes. Video games let players step into the sandals of warriors and demigods, battling monsters and confronting gods. In these forms, myth continued its oldest function: to thrill, to teach, to reveal the extraordinary hidden in the ordinary. The endurance of Greek myth lies not only in its stories, but in its adaptability. Each age finds in them what it needs. To the Greeks themselves, they were religion and ritual. To the tragedians, they were catharsis. To philosophers, allegory. To Christians, moral caution. to Renaissance painters' beauty, to romantic poets' passion, to modern thinkers' psychology. To us, they are entertainment, but also the deep grammar of storytelling itself. When we speak of a Trojan horse, a Pandora's box, a Herculean task, we echo myths without even realizing it. The language of Greek myth is everywhere in science where constellations bear their names, in literature where archetypes trace back to them, in our imaginations where gods and monsters still walk. And perhaps this is the greatest legacy of all Greek mythology, reminds us that stories never truly die. They shift their shapes like Proteus, adapting to the needs of each new teller. They live wherever there are questions about fate and freedom, about love and betrayal, about mortality and the divine. They endure because they are not only about gods or heroes, but about us, our fears, our hopes, our defiance, our longing for meaning in a vast and uncertain world. Thus, from the chants of Homer to the glow of cinema screens, from altars of stone to pages of novels, Greek myth continues its odyssey. The gods may have been silenced in prayer, but their voices remain echoing in every story we tell, whispering that even in our modern age, we still seek the old truths, who we are, where we come from, and what it means to be human beneath the endless sky. And now, as our journey comes to an end, let us set aside the thundering of hooves, the clang of bronze, the cries of heroes, and the schemes of gods. The world of Greek mythology drifts into stillness, like a torch guttering in the night, leaving behind only its gentle glow. Close your eyes and picture not the chaos of Olympus or the storm-swept seas, but the quiet shores of some forgotten island. The waves are slow, lapping softly against the sand. Above, constellations gleam, Orion with his belt, Cassiopeia on her throne, Perseus forever holding the head of Medusa. These are not just stars, but the eternal witnesses of stories long told, shining gently in the night sky, guiding sailors and dreamers alike. Think of Odysseus, who after all his trials finally laid his weary head at home. Think of Orpheus, who strummed his lyre to the edge of silence itself. Think of Icarus, who soared too high, but for a fleeting moment touched the sun. Their stories remain not as tragedies alone, but as reminders that longing, courage, love, and loss are woven into every life. Perhaps this is why the myths endure, because they whisper to us across centuries, reminding us that our own struggles are not so different. We too wrestle with pride and fate, with hope and despair. We too reach for meaning, even knowing how fragile it is. So let the voices of the gods grow quiet now. Let the heroes lay down their arms. Let the theater empty, the torches fade, the scrolls close. What remains is the hush of night and the comfort of knowing that stories, like the stars, never truly die. Sleep well, traveler. Sweet dreams.